You're listening to Trek FM.
Hello, and welcome to From There to Here, Trek FM's 50th anniversary rewatch of Star Trek, in which we look at all 729 episodes from beginning to end. I'm Mike from Stage 9.
I'm Ken from Standard Orbit.
And today we're going to look at 2 episodes of Deep Space Nine, Let He Who Is Without Sin and Things Past. So let's get started with Let He Who Is Without Sin. This is the Risa episode, where Worf and Dax decide to go to Risa for a little vacation, and Bashir and Lita and Quark decide to invite themselves along for the ride, and Worf, in opposition to sort of like the idea of Risa, decides that he's going to help out this group of Risian protesters who want to get back to the Federation's traditional values and shut places like Risa down because they're corrupting things. And Vanessa Williams shows up for a little while, and hijinks ensue.
Lots of hijinks, yes.
So, what do you think about this episode, Ken?
Not a fan of this episode. I'm a big Deep Space Nine guy. It's my second favorite series after TOS, and it isn't too often that I think that DS9 falls flat. But I think in this one, I've seen this trope so many times. It just doesn't work for me. There's always the evil evangelist. Not really all that flushed out and criticizing, other people. And it's not that that doesn't happen. And it's not that I'm even in agreement with it at all. I'm not. But I just felt like I've seen this too often, and you could tell where Worf was going, and he gets a few victories, and then he sees that these guys are way over the top, and it's wrong, and we should allow people to do what they want to do, and he comes a full 180 on it. But to me, it was predictable. It really wasn't all that funny, and Deep Space Nine does a lot of great writing, and I think a lot of great plots. And in this case, like I said, I could have told you from the second they landed on Risa and they meet this character exactly what was going to happen, and that's not too common for Deep Space Nine, but it happened in this case, and it just didn't work for me.
Yeah, this is, I think, the episode where if you were to ask the creators of Deep Space Nine, they would tell you that it is one of, if not the absolute worst episode of Deep Space Nine.
Really?
They hate this episode with a passion, and I don't hate it with that much passion. I think that the bad episodes of Deep Space Nine are very few and far between.
Right.
And I don't even know if I would call this episode bad necessarily. I think there's a lot of stupid stuff in it. But I don't know. There's a lot of stuff in it which I also do sort of appreciate. It's weird. Like, in terms of the plot, I think it's dumb. I think the whole storyline with Worf joining, these guys and everything, and them doing all this stuff, I don't think that any of that works at all. I think it is, pretty stupid and boring. But I like a lot of the sort of like little character moments and things that they do to kind of flesh out the world. It's very rare that we see places or sides of the Federation or really anywhere that are not involved with sort of like Starfleet, and not involved with the, if you want to call it, military, aspects of society.
Right.
And I think that it's interesting to see, and we've seen Risa before, but I think that this really kind of like expands on that quite a bit. The idea of like, well, this is where people go for vacation, and this is the type of things that people do on vacation and everything. These are the administrators of this, pleasure planet and stuff like that. I think that that's kind of interesting to see. And, I thought some of the character moments with like Bashir and Quark and Lita were funny. I like some of the conflict between Worf and Dax. I don't know. I mean, I think that like dramatically speaking, I don't think it works. But in terms of just sort of like giving insight into their relationship, I think it's interesting. If that means anything. I mean, I'm not gonna like go out and defend this episode. I'm not gonna be like, oh yeah, man, let's put on Let He Who Is Without Sin. But like watching it, for as much stupid stuff as in it, I find stuff which I think is interesting. But at the same time, like, I'm not violently opposed to any of the stupid stuff, and I'm not, gloriously in love with any of the stuff that I like. I think it is very middle of the road,
Yeah, well, I guess that's fair. What's interesting is when you say, all the writers and stuff, if they could take it back or they hated it or whatever. What was the other one? Prophet and Lace, I knew was one that didn't go over very well. But
that one, and I think Move Along Home is the other one.
Is it? Yeah. So there's bits and pieces on the backside of DS9 that I know a little bit about, but I don't know it as well. In other words, I haven't seen enough panels or read a companion book on DS9. I just loved the show, and it was the show that got my daughter really interested in Star Trek. We watched the whole thing on discs, 8 or 9 years ago. And when this episode came on, even back then, or the first time I saw it, I was just like, man, really? Because when they go in deep, and I think they're very respectful all the way around when it comes to faith, religion, all that other stuff, or the trappings, and it's okay to show that there's good and bad, because there's good and bad in everything. But this one was lazy. It was just lazy to me, and it's like this is. Like you said, I guess, and it makes sense to me that the writers felt this way, that they'd like to have this one back. It's like they put a lot of effort into really getting their plot points to mean something. And this could have been an episode, that was pulled out of several different 80s and 90s television shows, any kind of drama. We've seen this before. A young boy gets pulled in, or a young man, or whatever, and, then it turns around that even though they're trying to make things good and right, they're actually pretty bad or ignorant or whatever. So that's what I say.
It also feels like really manufactured. I mean, you see this in a lot of things, like let's say Data's Day, where they have the plot with like the Romulan spy or whatever. But like here in particular, it's like clearly when they were conceiving of this episode, I really don't think they were like, let's show like these guys who are like trying to take the Federation back to its earlier more conservative days or whatever. Like, I don't get the impression that was the driving force behind this episode at all. I think they wanted to show Risa and show these relationships, and then they were like, oh yeah, we've got to have conflict because this is an episode of Star Trek. Well, let's do this.
You're right.
But the conflict is so bad. And like having Worf join these people, I mean, that seems so uncharacteristic of him. Like I can see him getting into this fight with Jadzia. I cannot see him taking it to this extreme because he's not that petty and he's not that illogical. I mean, I see this as something that could potentially destroy his career, and they don't think of it as anything major, which is really weird. And but basically he was working with what turned out to be terrorists, and it's just like, whatever, I guess we're going home now.
Well, you make a very good point. Two things I'll say is, one, at least they spent some money and they went on location for a bit, right? So that's a nice thing. When you talk, like one of my favorite TNG episodes is Family, and there's no conflict in that, none, and it's all about relationships and dynamics and things. So you can have those episodes where you don't need to go down that road. And to me, it was just an unnecessary filler, and it wound up dominating the episode, and also to a point almost ticking me off. And it's like, do we always have to bring these types into play, and do we always have to play them this way? It shifted my view of things. Whereas good writing, good relationship shows, which in Deep Space Nine, there's a lot of action. It's probably one of the more action-oriented shows, but with a lot of thought and meaning behind it. It's okay to go to the other direction once in a while, and just talk about or have a talky show, quote unquote, in an exotic place and flesh out these characters a little bit more, because we always want to learn more about the characters, and we don't have to put them in these crazy situations. So, I guess it was a lost opportunity.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, should we move on to the next episode?
Yes,
today?
let's.
Things Past. Would you want to give a synopsis of this one?
Yeah, this is a very interesting episode where we find that our crew is on a runabout, and it gets caught up in, I don't know, how would you describe it, some kind of a distortion. And when they come to, they find themselves on Deep Space Nine, but Deep Space Nine is now Terok Nor. And you have the main crew is now Bajorans, except for Odo, who is still himself. And this winds up being a very fascinating story where we learn a lot about Odo and his past through this experience, which to me is a little fuzzy how it all comes about and how they get caught up in this. But essentially, there's an assassination attempt on Gul Dukat. 3 Bajorans, who originally were sentenced to death, are now played by our 3 main characters. And you always say like the hijinks ensues and so forth. But on a very serious note, they wind up pulling themselves out of it and getting back into their timeline. But the takeaway from this is that Odo, through his investigation, allowed 3 innocent Bajorans who were blamed or arrested, convicted of the assassination. He found out that they were innocent. And if he had done a more thorough job, he would have found that. But I think the key lesson here is that Odo still would have allowed them to be executed in order to maintain order on the station. And it was an eye-opening, very risky episode. So, Mike, what were your thoughts on this show?
Yeah, I think this one is really good. This is one which I think kind of falls through the cracks, at times, because it's not, one of the more famous episodes of Deep Space Nine, but it's one of those episodes which really, kind of hits home in a lot of ways, in terms of like the characters and stuff like that. I think it's interesting how you see this alternate reality, and and it's like a high concept show, and yet at the end of it's speaking to the past of one of our main characters, and at the end it really does sort of change your outlook on Odo in a lot of ways. And if there's that scene with Kira, at the end, and it's like, well, this is one of the strongest relationships on the show, and what happened, in this episode could like fundamentally change that relationship forever, and it's really interesting just the way that they kind of structured that, and the idea that they wanted to tell that story and change the character in that way. It's really, really fascinating. I like it quite a bit.
Yeah, I again, just as we talked a few episodes ago, about taking a radical turn with Jake, they did the same thing with Odo in this, and that's the gutsiness of the writers on this show, going in a direction you don't expect. There's tropes and plots and things that we see all the time in episodic television, and Deep Space Nine, I think, does such an excellent job with its own characters going in directions you don't expect. Most of the time in the other Star Trek series, you get an idea, or they don't really flesh out the characters all that much, and they fill a role, and they sometimes have a few character moments here and there, but from a past experience, there isn't this hidden dark thing that we ever find out, really. And with Odo to go in this direction, I thought, wow, that is really a game changer. Interesting, though, that the relationship going on with Odo and Kira doesn't seem to be all that much impacted as the episodes went on.
Yeah,
you thought it
true.
really was going to knock it out of the park, because this is pretty explosive. I mean, 3 innocent people died, and you put yourself in his position, what would you have done? And it really points to some flaws. And again, it gets very introspective because here he is saying, admittingly, if he had done a little bit more investigation, if he had probed a little bit harder, he would have found that they were innocent, and he just flat out didn't do it. And it's incredible. And I think this was, again, another gutsy Deep Space Nine episode. And everybody loves Odo, and you have a very different view of Odo after this episode, even though they really don't go back to this. I don't recall them really talking about it again.
Yeah. No, but it is definitely true. And, I think that, Odo probably has sort of like gone through, a lot of this, internally, over the years. And for all we know, that this really kind of informed the person that he became prior to, when we were even introduced to him. But, but yeah, no, I think it's definitely a really strong episode. And, it's one that really kind of, flies under the radar for the most part, but it totally works,
I agree.
All right. Well, Ken, where can people find you on the internet?
You can find me as a co-host of Standard Orbit. You can find me on the Babel Conference quite often, Trek FM's Facebook page, or you can find me on Twitter at BostonSCPO. Where can they find you, sir?
You can find me right here on Trek FM doing Stage 9, where we talk about the people who make Star Trek. And you can also find me on Twitter at Mumbles3K. Well, thanks for joining me for this block, Ken. Really appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me.
And I will be back tomorrow with Brandon to talk about 2 more episodes of Star Trek, Voyager's Warlord and Deep Space Nine's The Ascent.